Today we're talking about something many men quietly struggle with but rarely get clear guidance on. What not to do when a woman starts losing interest in you. Not how to win her back, not how to impress harder, but the specific behaviors that guarantee things get worse even when your intentions are good. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever felt that shift, the replies getting shorter, the warmth cooling off, the connection feeling uncertain, this conversation is for you. And I want to approach it the way I would in a therapy room. Calm, honest, grounded in real patterns I've seen over and over again. Here's the controversial part most men don't expect. Losing her interest isn't what ruins the dynamic. Your reaction to it is. In my experience working with men, the moment they sense emotional distance, something almost automatic kicks in. They start trying to fix, chase, explain, or prove. And without realizing it, they begin doing the very things that push attraction further away. I've sat across from men who were confident, self-assured, and grounded at the beginning of a relationship. But the second they felt uncertain, they abandoned all of that. Not because they were weak, but because they were human. Fear has a way of hijacking behavior when we don't understand what's actually happening beneath the surface. This video isn't about blaming women. It's not about shaming men either. It's about understanding emotional dynamics so you stop acting against your own interests. When a woman loses interest, the situation is fragile. Certain responses escalate tension, lower respect, and quietly change how she sees you, even if she can't explain why. What I'm going to share comes from years of observing the same mistakes play out in different forms across different personalities and situations. Different men, same outcomes. If you've ever wondered, why did everything fall apart right after I tried harder? Stay with me, because once you understand what not to do, you gain something far more valuable than tactics. You gain emotional control, and that changes everything. 1. Chasing for reassurance instead of staying grounded. When a woman starts losing interest, the first mistake I see men make, again and again, is chasing reassurance instead of staying emotionally grounded. And I want to be very clear here because this is where things quietly fall apart. Chasing doesn't always look desperate on the surface. Sometimes it looks polite, sometimes it looks caring, sometimes it even looks mature, but emotionally it comes from the same place. Fear of losing connection. In my work as a therapist, I've noticed a pattern. The moment a man senses distance, his focus shifts outward. He starts monitoring her tone, her replies, her mood. He begins asking subtle questions, fishing for certainty. Are we okay? Did I do something wrong? You seem different lately. These questions feel reasonable to him. After all, he's trying to understand, but what's really happening is that he's handing over his emotional balance to her response. Here's what most men don't realize. Reassurance seeking changes the emotional dynamic instantly. Instead of being two grounded individuals choosing each other, the relationship turns into one person regulating the other's anxiety. And that doesn't create closeness. It creates pressure. I've watched women describe this feeling without using harsh words. They'll say things like, I felt like I had to constantly reassure him, or it became heavy, or I didn't know why, but I felt less drawn. Staying grounded doesn't mean acting cold or pretending you don't care. It means staying anchored in who you are, even when uncertainty shows up. Men who stay grounded don't rush to fix discomfort. They allow space without panic. They understand that attraction breathes better when it isn't cornered. I remember conversations where men told me, the more distant she got, the more I tried to show up. And on the surface, that sounds noble. But emotionally, what she felt was pursuit driven by fear, not presence driven by confidence. One pushes away, the other invites connection. When you chase reassurance, you unintentionally communicate something powerful, that your sense of stability depends on her response. That's not attractive, not because it's wrong to care, but because attraction requires emotional self-containment. A woman needs to feel that you can hold yourself steady even when things aren't perfect. Grounded men don't demand certainty in moments that are uncertain. They don't interrogate emotional shifts. They observe, adjust, and maintain their dignity. And ironically, that calm often does more to reopen connection than any question ever could. The goal isn't to suppress emotion, it's to regulate it. When you stop chasing reassurance, you give both of you room to feel again. And that room is often where interest either returns or clarity finally arrives. 2. Over-explaining your feelings when silence would speak louder. The second mistake I see men make when a woman starts losing interest is over-explaining their feelings. And this one is tricky because it often comes disguised as emotional maturity. Men tell me, "I was just trying to communicate," or "I wanted to be honest about how I felt." On the surface, that sounds healthy, but timing and emotional context matter more than most people realize. When interest is already fading, over-explaining doesn't create clarity, it creates pressure. From my experience as a therapist, I've watched men talk themselves out of attraction by saying too much, too soon, and too intensely. They begin unpacking every emotion, every fear, every interpretation of her behavior. They explain why they're confused, why they're hurt, why they care, why they're trying. What they don't notice is that the conversation stops being mutual and starts becoming a presentation. Here's what's happening emotionally. When you over-explain, you're trying to control the outcome through words. You're hoping that if you say it the right way, she'll understand, feel reassured, and come back emotionally. But attraction doesn't respond to explanations. It responds to emotional experience. And long explanations often feel like emotional weight being placed in her hands. I've heard women describe this without hostility. They'll say things like, "I felt overwhelmed," or "it was too much," or "I didn't know how to respond." Not because the man did anything cruel, but because he removed all space from the dynamic. Silence, when used correctly, creates room for reflection. Over-explaining fills every corner with tension. Silence doesn't mean ignoring her or playing games. It means resisting the urge to narrate your internal world while the connection is unstable. It means trusting that not every feeling needs immediate expression. In healthy relationships, emotions are shared. In fragile moments, restraint becomes strength. One pattern I've seen repeatedly is that men feel relief after over-explaining. They think, "At least I said my piece." But relief for you doesn't equal attraction for her. Often, it does the opposite. It places her in a position where she feels responsible for how you feel, and that subtly shifts the balance. Emotionally grounded men understand this. They speak when it adds value, not when it soothes anxiety. They let their behavior communicate stability. They allow pauses. They don't rush to fill silence with explanations that are really pleas for reassurance. Sometimes saying less communicates confidence, self-respect, and emotional maturity far more clearly than any long message ever could. And when interest is uncertain, what you don't say often matters more than what you do. 3. Trying to negotiate attraction through logic and effort. The third mistake men make when a woman starts losing interest is trying to negotiate attraction through logic and effort. This usually shows up as problem solving. Men start analyzing what went wrong, offering explanations, presenting reasons why the relationship still makes sense. They increase effort, become more available, more agreeable, more accommodating, believing that consistency and reasoning will restore what's fading. From a therapeutic perspective, this response is understandable, but deeply misguided. Attraction is not a contract you can renegotiate once the emotional energy shifts. I've watched men approach this moment as if they're in a meeting, laying out evidence of their value, how supportive they've been, how much they care, how serious they are, how they're willing to adjust. They think effort equals desire, but desire doesn't follow logic. It follows emotional resonance. In many sessions, men describe feeling confused. "I did everything right," they say. And often they did, on paper. But relationships don't live on paper. They live in feeling. When you try to reason your way back into attraction, you unintentionally turn intimacy into obligation. She starts feeling like she should feel something rather than actually feeling it. This is where effort backfires. More texts, more check-ins, more compromises, more explanations. Each one is meant to prove reliability. But emotionally, it communicates something else, that you're trying to earn what used to be freely given. That shift is subtle, but powerful. It changes how she experiences you, from someone she desires to someone she evaluates. I've seen women struggle to explain this dynamic. They'll say, "He was great, but I just didn't feel it anymore." And the man hears that as irrational. So he pushes harder with logic. He asks for reasons. He wants specifics. But feelings don't always come with bullet point explanations. And demanding them often creates resistance, not clarity. Men who understand attraction know when to stop negotiating. They don't try to persuade someone into wanting them. They recognize that desire cannot be convinced. It can only be invited. When interest fades, the healthiest response is not to double down on effort, but to step back into self-respect. Stepping back doesn't mean giving up or becoming passive. It means refusing to bargain for emotional connection. It means holding your standards even when uncertainty appears. Paradoxically, this is often the moment when attraction either resets or clearly ends, both outcomes offering dignity instead of depletion. Trying harder feels productive, but emotionally it signals imbalance. When you stop negotiating attraction and return to grounded presence, you stop chasing approval and start honoring yourself. And that shift, whether it brings her back or not, is always the stronger position to stand in. 4. Losing your emotional center to win her attention. The fourth mistake often shows up not at the beginning of dating, but inside an existing relationship. This is where it becomes especially painful, because the man isn't reacting to a stranger pulling away. He's reacting to someone he's already invested in. When a woman starts losing interest within a relationship, many men respond by slowly losing their emotional center in an attempt to win her attention back. I've worked with men who were once steady, decisive, and emotionally anchored in their relationships. Over time, as they sensed a shift, less warmth, more distance, fewer moments of connection, they began changing themselves in subtle ways. They stopped voicing opinions. They avoided conflict. They adjusted their behavior to match her moods, not out of manipulation, but out of fear of losing what they had. This is where self-abandonment begins. Inside relationships, losing your emotional center doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks like constantly checking her emotional temperature before speaking. It looks like reshaping your routines, values, and boundaries to keep things calm. The man tells himself he's being supportive, but emotionally, he's outsourcing his stability. From a therapeutic lens, this is one of the most damaging patterns I see. Attraction inside a relationship depends on emotional polarity, two people who are connected but still whole. When one partner collapses inward to preserve closeness, the dynamic shifts. She may not consciously notice it, but she feels it. The relationship starts to feel less secure, not more. I remember sessions where men said, "I don't even recognize myself anymore." They were still present physically, still showing up, but internally they felt smaller. And the more they tried to adapt to keep her interest, the more disconnected she became. Not because she wanted control, but because attraction cannot survive when one person loses their grounding. In relationships, attention should be shared, not chased. When you sacrifice your emotional center, you send an unspoken message. I need you to feel okay. That creates pressure, not intimacy. No partner wants to feel responsible for another adult's emotional stability. Staying centered doesn't mean being rigid or unloving. It means remaining aligned with your values, your voice, and your boundaries even when things feel uncertain. It means choosing connection without self-erasure. When a man reclaims his emotional center, something important happens. The relationship either regains balance or it reveals a truth that was already there. Both outcomes are healthier than slowly disappearing inside a dynamic that requires you to shrink. Holding your center isn't about control, it's about self-respect. And in relationships, self-respect is the foundation that keeps attraction alive. 5. Asking for clarity when her behavior is already clear. The fifth mistake often happens deep inside a relationship, not during the early stages. A man senses a shift, less affection, fewer check-ins, a subtle emotional withdrawal, and instead of trusting what he's observing, he asks for clarity. On the surface, this sounds healthy. Communication is encouraged in relationships after all, but when behavior is already sending a message, asking for clarity can quietly undermine attraction. In my experience working with men in long-term relationships, this moment is emotionally loaded. The man isn't asking because he's curious. He's asking because he's hoping the answer will soothe his discomfort. He wants reassurance that things are still okay, even when his instincts tell him something has changed. So he asks, "Are we good?" Or, "Do you still feel the same about us?" Or, "What's going on with you lately?" Here's the uncomfortable truth. Behavior is communication. When affection drops, when effort becomes inconsistent, when presence fades, those are answers. Words can soften them, delay them, or deny them, but they don't erase them. I've seen women respond to these questions with comfort instead of honesty, not out of manipulation, but out of guilt. They don't want to hurt someone they care about, so they say things are fine even when they're not. This creates a dangerous loop. The man hears the words and ignores the behavior. He clings to verbal reassurance while the emotional reality continues to drift. Over time, he becomes more confused, more anxious, and more dependent on check-ins for stability. Meanwhile, she feels increasingly pressured to maintain a version of the relationship she's emotionally leaving. In relationships, asking for clarity too early or too often can freeze the dynamic. Instead of allowing space for feelings to evolve naturally, it forces a premature conversation that neither person is ready to have. Attraction needs room to move. Interrogating it can make it retreat. Men who are emotionally grounded trust patterns over promises. They don't need constant verbal confirmation when actions are already speaking. They observe, adjust, and respond with self-respect rather than desperation. That might mean pulling back slightly, recentering themselves, or addressing the relationship from a place of strength instead of fear. Clarity doesn't come from questions alone. It comes from alignment between words and behavior. When those two don't match, the answer is already there. Inside a relationship, maturity isn't demanding emotional certainty at all times. It's having the courage to face what's unfolding without forcing it into a conversation meant to calm your anxiety. When you stop asking for clarity that behavior has already provided, you regain something far more important, your emotional footing. 6. Shifting into people-pleasing to avoid abandonment. The sixth mistake men make when they feel a woman pulling away is slipping into people-pleasing mode. This shift is subtle, and that's why it's so dangerous. It doesn't start with grand gestures or dramatic changes. It starts internally. A man begins to think, if I'm easier, more agreeable, less demanding, she won't leave. And from that moment on, his behavior stops being authentic and starts being strategic. From my experience working with men, people-pleasing is almost never about kindness. It's about fear. Fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment. The man convinces himself he's being understanding, patient, supportive, but emotionally, he's bargaining. He's hoping that by minimizing himself, he can preserve the connection. What actually happens is the opposite. When you shift into people-pleasing, you slowly erase your emotional edges. You stop expressing needs. You avoid saying no. You tolerate things that quietly bother you. You over-accommodate schedules, moods, and boundaries. And while this may reduce tension in the short term, it creates a deeper imbalance underneath. I've heard men say, "I didn't want to push her away, so I let things slide." Over time, they didn't just lose the relationship, they lost themselves inside it. And here's the part many don't expect. People-pleasing doesn't make a woman feel safer, it makes her feel uncertain. When someone abandons their own center, the dynamic becomes unstable. There's no grounded presence to lean into. Attraction requires contrast. It requires two whole individuals choosing each other, not one person orbiting the other. When you people please, you communicate that your needs are optional, that your boundaries are flexible, that your identity is negotiable. That doesn't create closeness, it creates emotional erosion. In sessions, women often struggle to articulate why this shift feels uncomfortable. They'll say things like, "He was too accommodating," or "I felt like I was leading everything," not because they wanted dominance, but because polarity disappeared. The relationship stopped feeling alive. Engaging with this mistake requires honesty. Ask yourself whether your kindness is coming from abundance or anxiety. Are you choosing to give or are you giving to be chosen? Those two motivations feel very different on the receiving end. Men who maintain attraction don't abandon their needs to keep someone. They stay generous without being self-sacrificing. They remain open without becoming invisible. They understand that being loved at the cost of self-respect is not love, it's survival. When you stop people-pleasing, you don't become harsh or cold. You become real again. And real connection can only happen when both people are standing on their own emotional ground. 7. Reacting from fear instead of self-respect. The seventh mistake is often the most damaging because it sits underneath all the others, reacting from fear instead of self-respect. By the time a man reaches this point, he's usually exhausted. He's tried understanding, adjusting, explaining, and waiting, and when none of it restores the connection, fear takes over his behavior. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks impulsive. Sometimes it looks defensive. Sometimes it looks like saying things you don't fully mean just to get a reaction. In my experience as a therapist, this is the moment where men act in ways that don't reflect who they truly are, not because they're irrational, but because fear narrows perspective. When fear is in control, everything becomes urgent. Silence feels threatening. Distance feels personal. Neutral behavior feels like rejection. The man starts reacting to possibilities instead of reality. He might confront too aggressively, withdraw completely without clarity, or oscillate between closeness and distance. None of these responses come from strength. They come from a nervous system trying to protect itself. Self-respect operates differently. It slows things down. It allows discomfort without demanding immediate resolution. Men rooted in self-respect don't chase emotional certainty when it's unavailable, but they also don't punish or manipulate. They respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. I've seen men regret fear-based reactions long after the relationship ended, not because the relationship could have been saved, but because they didn't recognize themselves in those moments. Fear pushed them to cross their own boundaries, say things out of alignment, or abandon dignity for short-term relief. That regret cuts deeper than rejection. Reacting from self-respect means choosing behavior you can stand by regardless of the outcome. It means asking yourself, if this ends, will I respect how I handled it? That question alone changes everything. It shifts your focus from control to character. Self-respect also communicates something powerful without words. It tells the other person that you value yourself enough not to collapse under uncertainty, that you can face loss without losing integrity. And paradoxically, that stability is often what keeps communication open longer than fear ever could. Fear makes you small. Self-respect makes you steady. One begs for outcomes. The other allows them to unfold. When a woman loses interest, you can't control how she feels, but you can control how you show up. And when you choose self-respect over fear, you walk away, whether together or apart, with something no one can take from you, your sense of self intact. When a woman starts losing interest, the instinct to chase, explain, negotiate, or please can feel natural, but these reactions often push her further away. The key isn't trying harder, it's staying grounded, preserving your emotional center, and responding from self-respect. Attraction thrives when you maintain boundaries, trust behavioral signals, and resist fear-driven impulses. Every misstep, over-explaining, people-pleasing, or seeking reassurance erodes your presence and shifts the dynamic. By understanding these patterns and choosing self-respect over reaction, you protect your dignity, create emotional clarity, and position yourself in a way that either reignites genuine connection or allows you to move forward stronger.